Gerd Apfelthaler. I'm the Dean of School of Management. The Entrepreneur Roundtable is a series that we put on for everybody interested in entrepreneurship, the creation of startups, young and budding entrepreneurs, future entrepreneurs, everybody who has an interest in that topic. And of course, at the School of Management, we understand entrepreneurship in two different ways. The one is the actual creation of companies, from ideation to creating a business model, a business concept, to pitching and to trading and to selling. And then there's of course the other aspect too, which is focused on the entrepreneurial mindset, to create entrepreneurs, to instill entrepreneurial thinking in people, to create the people who stand up when you fall, who see opportunities where others see challenges, to have persistence, to work tirelessly. And today I'm really happy to have somebody here who has combined in his career, in his life, the two aspects of creating very viable businesses and actually show that tenacity that it takes to be an entrepreneur. Jerry Heller is with us today, who is a legend in the music business and the music industry. He can be counted as one of the select few in the music industry who had a significant role in shaping trends and musical movements for 5 decades, spanning from being the first person in the United States to bring somebody by the name of Elton John to this country, to creating a highly controversial group called NWA, out of which people such as Dr. Dre or Ice Cube emerged. Please join me in welcoming Jerry Heller.
Thank you. Can you all hear me?
Yes.
So I grew up in a small town in the Midwest. I had the privilege of going to a high school that the average student size in the class was about 8 students. It was in a little suburb outside, about 12 miles from Cleveland, and was really one of the great public schools in America. You know, I've discussed this with Bill Clinton many times, that the public school system really can work in this country. It just doesn't. But it can, because I went to a school that did. And just before I get started, I went back there to be inducted into the Hall of Fame in 2003. And the school is now 50% African American and 50% Caucasian. And when I went there, I think that of the class, there was 300 students. I think that we had a half a dozen National Merit Scholars. Well, the year that I was there last, which was 2003, with the mix of the school the way it is, we had 129 National Merit Scholars there that year, plus the top 10 Latin students in America were all from Shaker Heights High School. So the public school system can work. So I always felt that I had an advantage when I got started. I went to a little school in southern Ohio and played sports there. Got hurt in my junior year and went and saw a movie called Summer Place, and decided I wanted to come to California. I stopped in Las Vegas on the way and stayed there for summer because these friends of my dad's owned several hotels there in Las Vegas. And I stayed there and then came out and enrolled at USC in my junior year, because really it was the only college in Los Angeles that accepted all my credits. I mean, none of the other schools, accepted my credits. So I went to USC, and for those of you students, it was $8 a unit. Then I went to graduate school business there, and they had raised it to like $32 a unit, and everyone was just in an uproar. But I got out of school and went to the Army, and got out of the Army and had had no idea of what I wanted to do. My cousin was an entertainer, and he said to me, I'm gonna get you a job with my agent. And he did, and with a master's degree, I was getting $125 a week, which is $99.75 after taxes. And I was in the music business. And I got started in rock and roll about the beginning of rock and roll around '64 when the Beatles came here. And my first act was a group called the Standells with a #1 record called Dirty Water. And then, I mean, it's always seemed to me, like with my education and everything else, because the most successful guys in my business have never gone to college. David Geffen, who just gave another $880 million to UCLA, didn't graduate from high school. In 1970, a young kid was a freshman at the University of Illinois, wrote me a letter, told me he wanted to be in the music business. I flew him out, I hired him. His name was Irving Azoff. So, and he dropped out of college in his freshman year. So, you know, in my business, it's sort of a strange kind of business. It's not really, although I always felt good about my education, it certainly isn't everything. And I really didn't know what I wanted to do at all. Rock and roll was starting. I liked rock and roll. I was young. And then I walked into a bar one night in San Francisco because I heard a lot of good-looking nurses hung out there. And there was a group there called the Gollywogs. And I said, wow, you guys are really good. I changed your name, and they changed it to Creedence Clearwater. And I mean, I was really on my way. And in those days, the mob owned everything. In Vegas, they owned the music business. And I worked for the most powerful man in America. His name was Sidney Korshak. He was a lawyer from Chicago. He owned the New York Yankees. Our offices were where Chanel is now on Rodeo Drive. Those were our offices. He represented the hotel and restaurant workers in Nevada. He represented IATSE and most of the labor unions in show business. And he was the actual guy in The Godfather that put the horse's head in the guy's bed. So I worked for Sidney Korshak, and his main clients were the Wasserman, who founded Universal and MCA, and a little fund called the Teamsters Union Pension Fund, who built every hotel in Nevada, plus La Costa, and were really responsible for most of the growth in Nevada. So I worked for Korshak, and then I left him and went to work for a guy named Jerry Crenshaw. Jerry Crenshaw is an incredible guy. He's the guy that has his own golf course in the Malibu Colony. You know, in my day, everybody started off as agents. So I started off as an agent, David Geffen, obviously Irving Azoff did because he worked for me, Frank Barcelona. All of the guys that became successful in the music business all started off as agents. That was the stepping stone in those days. So I worked for Jerry Crenshaw, and we represented Elizabeth Taylor and Richard Burton, Jane Fonda and Roger Vadim. We represented Henry Mancini, Andy Williams, John Mathis. We represented most of the big MOR artists. And I was brought in there to start a rock and roll department for them. In 1969, a guy sent me a tape, and it was by a young guy named Reginald Dwight III. And Reginald Dwight III is the guy that today funds the entire AIDS research program in the city of Los Angeles named Dr. John. And I brought him here in 1969 and opened him at the Troubadour, and then turned him over to my assistant when I found this other group I liked called Pink Floyd. And then I represented Marvin Gaye, Journey, Styx, REO Speedwagon, most of the big rock and roll groups in the world. I represented a German group who founded the electronic movement called Kraftwerk, and I brought them here in 1973 on my American Express card. They did no business, but they actually made all their own computers and instruments. And I see where they're still touring. But I grew up at a time when we were in an unpopular war in Vietnam. Campus radicals like Mario Salvo at Berkeley and the students at Columbia, the Diggers and the Black Panthers. These were all people that I knew. I represented Eldridge Cleaver. I made his book deal for Soul and Ice. So I grew up at a very interesting time in American history. And while I don't really relish being as old as I am now, although it's better than the alternative, I guess. But I'm reading a book now called When Tough Guys Get Old. And it's very difficult. You know? Getting older is difficult. I represented the Diggers in San Francisco, who were a group of guys run by a gentleman named Emmett Grogan. And at 3:30 in the morning, they would go around to all the restaurants in San Francisco, get their leftover food, and feed the homeless in Golden Gate Park the next afternoon at 3 o'clock. So I grew up at a very time. I worked for Teddy Kennedy. I knew Bobby Kennedy very well, Jack not so well. Because actually, believe it or not, see, these guys were all really mob guys from Prohibition. Joe Kennedy was a mob guy. Aristotle Onassis was a mob guy. Howard Hughes, they were all mob guys. They brought up molasses from the islands during Prohibition. They brought it up through a Cleveland group called the Mayfield Road Mob, of which my father was a member. And they took it across Lake Erie on a boat. They called it the Jewish Neighbors. They took it by boat across Lake Erie to Windsor, Ontario, where Edgar Rothman, the man who owns Seagrass, would distill it and bring it back, and then Joe Kennedy and Aristotle Onassis would distribute it. So, you know, that's the way it was in those days. And I always felt that, look, I play no instruments, I can't carry a tune. Elton John once said on stage in front of 100,000 people that I was the only person he ever met that couldn't keep time on a tambourine. And, you know, it's true. But I've always felt good about a couple of things. I've always been in the right place at the right time, and sometimes timing is more important than anything else. I mean, I was in rock and roll at the beginning of rock and roll, you know, Creedence Clearwater, Elton John, Pink Floyd, and all of these acts. And I always felt good about what I did because I always represented the little guy. I never represented the big guy. The most powerful lobby in California is the agency lobby. And that's why a personal manager nowadays has a very weak position, because the big agencies like Wade Morris and CAA and ICM, they fund this lobby. And the Labor Commission law is the most unjust, unethical law that I've ever seen, but it's funded by the big agencies, and they put a lot of money, and that's just so they can get their 10%. In the state of California, a personal manager can only advise and counsel. A personal manager cannot secure employment. You must go through an agency to secure employment in the state of California. And if you don't, then a couple of things can happen to you. Number one, it invalidates your contract with your artist. And number two, up until last year, they were able to disgorge all of your previous earnings, and you would have to pay back everything that you had made. That no longer is true. Cher fired her manager right before she opened a multi-year deal in Vegas. I think she plays Caesars, where Celine plays. But she fired her manager right before that, and even though she was able to get out of the contract, she still had to pay commissions. So I think it's ironic that around 1964, 65, 66, the group that most of us consider the most important group in the history of the world, the Beatles, ironically ruined the music business the first time around. Sgt. Pepper set the bar so impossibly high for everybody else that it changed the focus of the music business from the music to getting the records played. So once again, you now have the mob guys inserting themselves in this position where they were the guys that got your record played. And the music no longer mattered, because if you didn't get your record played, it cost people their jobs. It cost people at the record companies their jobs. So it became easier to say no and take a chance and say yes and sign an act that maybe you believed in, because if you said no, you couldn't jeopardize your job. So, you know, that went on for a while, and the music business has a basic economic integrity that I've never seen in any other business. In every other business that I've ever looked at, the more you make, the less someone else makes. That's just the way it is. In the music business, the more the artist makes, the more everybody makes. When the artist makes more, the manager makes more, the agent makes more, the publicist makes more, the attorney makes, everybody makes more. So it has a certain economic integrity. The Beatles actually ruined that balance of integrity in the business. So I had become very disenchanted with what was happening in the music business. I was going through my first divorce at that time, and I actually moved back to Encino and moved into my mother's condo because I was tired of seeing my wife's friends in Beverly Hills asking me what happened. And a friend of mine who represented a lot of old blues artists in Chicago, like Charlie Musselwhite and Howlin' Wolf and artists like that, Curtis Mayfield, he said to me, you know, you really got to check out this scene that's happening at this little pressing plant. Sometimes I get choked up when I talk about this. Because my partner founded this with died of AIDS when he was 31. So I went to, I finally got around, I used to go down to Compton, hang out at this pub called Eve After Dark, and that's where it was sort of the center of the rap movement. I was obviously the only white person there, and I was always treated with respect. Everything was always cool when I went down there. So the guy that told me about this little pressing plant on Santa Monica Boulevard, $1,000, you printed up 500 records, and that this guy, this older gentleman named Don McMillan, would then send the records out, vinyl, to people all over the country that did what he did. There's another 5 or 6 pressing plants, one in Atlanta, one in Texas, you know, that did the same thing that he did. And if he sold any records for you, he would charge you 15%. But when you sold 25,000 records, you made $50,000. So this little thing that was happening at this pressing plant, guys were cutting records in their mother's garages for $200. I mean, the tape cost more than it did to actually cut the record after the Beatles had spent 60,000 hours on Sgt. Pepper. And there's nobody a bigger Beatles fan than I am. And, you know, I understand what they did to the business. So I went over there and I met a guy from Cleveland who had a group called the LA Dream Team, and I liked what they were doing because what they were doing reestablished the economic integrity of the music business. So I had the only bank account. Most of these guys had no insurance, they'd never had a bank account. And if one of their cars was stolen, they would never go to the police to try and get it back. So that was just, wasn't even in the, that was just out of the question. So I meet this guy, Rudy Pardee from Cleveland, he had the LA Dream Team, and this group called JJ Fed, and I make a deal with him, and then pressing at McCullough were the foundation of the music business up till electronic music, which looks like it's the new music of the future. But pressing there were Ice-T, MC Hammer, World Class Wrecking Crew, CIA, Egyptian Lover. Every major rap act in the world was doing that there, and I loved what they were doing. So the guy that owned Eve After Dark, he and I had a little business deal together, and he said to me, you know, there's this guy that wants to meet you, his name is Eric Wright.
Yo, man, I don't think they heard you. Why don't you tell them what your name is?
My name is Easy, yeah, this is true. Keeping your attention is what I'm gonna do. Hardcore, yo, I can never be soft. Ask them am I deaf and they say the boy goes off. Building up momentum with a touch of my rhyme. Suckers stay away because, yo, they know the time. Quiet on the seconds, I'm about to begin. And if you didn't...
And I said, yeah, well, tell me about this. Well, he's a drug dealer, and, you know, he lives in Compton, and I said, yeah, you know, I'm doing fine, and I'm not really anxious. You know, it was right about the time of Iran-Contra, with the CIA, you know, flooding crack through dealers in our inner cities, you know, to fund Iran-Contra. And, I mean, I know guys like Freeway Rick Ross, whose cutout was Oliver North. I mean, that's who he dealt through. So, I said, you know, there's RICO now, and, you know, I don't want somebody showing up at my mother's house one day and saying, this house isn't yours anymore. I said, I'm really not interested in that. So he kept after me and after me and after me, and finally said, you know, Jerry, this guy Eric Wright wants to meet you, and he offered me $750 to meet you. He said, I really could use the money. So I said, okay, I'll meet with the guy. March 3rd of 1987. He said, I'm going to be at McCullough, which was this little pressing plant on Santa Monica Boulevard. So I'm there, and he pulls up in this Suzuki Samurai, all tricked out with a couple of his guys, and he gets out, and he was cool. I mean, next to the word cool in the dictionary, there's a picture of Eric Wright, and this guy was cool, with his jerry curls, and I mean, he just had a presence about him, a certain charisma that I was able to relate to. So basically, show business is basically a bullshit business. You know, you're dealing with things that are really intangible. So I said to him, you got something you want me? First he reached in his sock and pulled out a roll of money and paid Alonzo the $750. And then I said, you got something you want me to hear? This guy don't say one word to me, not a word. He just hands me a cassette. I'm not used to that. I'm used to people saying, I got the greatest this and the greatest that, and, you know, this is my boy, and this is my girl, and my group, and my song. This guy, he doesn't say anything, he just hands me a cassette. Well, the first I put it in the CD player. And the first song I heard was Boys in the Hood. And I just couldn't believe it. And like, he was probably 19, I was in my mid-40s at the time. So I had the advantage of growing up with the Panthers and the Stones and Gil Scott-Heron and the great political and sociological forces of an earlier generation. And this music, to me, was a combination of the Black Panthers and Gil Scott-Heron and the rebellion of the Rolling Stones. And I said, wow, this is really it. I said, what do you call this group? And he said, NWA. I said, what's that stand for? No whites allowed? And he just laughed and he said, not really. And he played me straight out of Compton. straight out of Compton, crazy MF named Ice Cube with a band called Niggers with Attitudes. And I said, whoa, this is really heavy. I said, but for the first time, here's a guy that's presenting the problems of our inner city without burning buildings down and bombing National Guard armies. I said, here's a guy that's going to change the world. So the next day I called a meeting of all the clients I represented, Journey and all these people, and told them that I was running a business. And I was making probably $650,000 a year at the time, with no muss, no fuss, no strain. And I told them all that I was going to business with this guy, Eric Wright. So we go into business, and the music I knew was there. So that took one of the elements out of what I had to do. I didn't have to find a great musical force. I mean, this guy was handing me, once again, I mean, tried to meet with me for months, and then paid the guy to meet me. So once again, there I was. So my problem, the element of music was taken out of the equation. My problem became a marketing problem rather than a music problem. How am I going to get people outside of our inner cities to listen to this music and to buy it? I thought at the time that the cutting edge people in our society were surfers and skateboarders that lived in Huntington Beach. And they were on the cutting edge of what was happening. This is 1987. So I go down to Huntington Beach, and I'm hanging out there for a couple months, and what are they buying? They're buying Metallica, Appetite for Destruction by Guns N' Roses. They're buying Suicidal Tendencies. I said, wait a second. Anybody of those 30 million people that bought Appetite for Destruction, they got to buy NWA. I said, that's my audience. My audience is the exact same audience that Guns N' Roses is. So if you look at any interview or video or anything that any of those groups did between 87 and 91, you'll see that they're wearing Compton hats and straight out of Compton t-shirts and, you know, all NWA paraphernalia. So the minute that they said that NWA was cool, it wasn't just Jerry Heller saying it was cool. Slash and Axl and Metallica, they're saying these guys are cool. So now for the first time in the history of the music business, people in Kansas and Nebraska and in Minnesota and places like that are buying NWA and Public Enemy. You know, they're buying groups that were going to shape the world for the next 25 years. The LA Times, which isn't exactly a liberal periodical, called NWA the most important act of the 20th century. And Straight Outta Compton, the most important album of the second half of the 20th century. That included people like the Beatles and Sgt. Pepper and Jimi Hendrix and Frank Sinatra and everyone else. So, just a couple of anecdotes as we move along. So, when we started to do well, and once we started to do well, it happened very quickly. Well, Foreign Elle magazine, which is like the Vogue of Europe, did a 12-page spread in Foreign Elle magazine called Gangster Chic, which was just NWA. This is a fashion magazine with guys wearing their pants down and their underpants over their pants, their hats on sideways. Foreign Elle magazine. And we bought a table for City of Hope dinner, which was, I don't know, $35,000 to $50,000, whatever it was. And I guess we got on the list because Eric and I got invited to have lunch at the White House with President Bush. And we were invited to join the Republican Senate leadership. And of course, Eric, who's Eazy-E, you know, to him, there was nothing about politics. He could care less. All he cared about was the mayor of Compton. And, but he had this unquenchable thirst for knowledge, and he wanted to experience everything that he could possibly experience. I mean, he sat in the Rodney King courthouse in Simi Valley every day. And you know, Rodney King isn't exactly the first black guy who ever got beat up on the freeway by a bunch of cops. Just the first time anyone ever videotaped it. So times were changing. So he said, what should we do? I said, we really should go. This is really cool. Let's go to the White House. I had been there once before during the Nixon administration because I had made the enemies of the president in this through Vietnam. And I was there with Jane Fonda and Tom Hayden and all the other radicals. And we go to the White House and we fly into D.C. and Bob Schieffer meets us at the airport. And he said, Jerry Heller, I said, yeah, he's Bob Schieffer, obviously I knew who he was. He said, I got a camera crew and I want to stay with you until your lunch with George Bush. And I said, sure, that'd be great. He said, you know, you understand that he doesn't know who, that Eric Wright is Eazy-E. I said, no, I guess they just took our name off the list because we were contributors to the City Hall. I said, I guess that was it. And he stayed with us for the whole time we were there with the camera crew. And I think Newsweek comes out on Tuesday. We were at lunch with the president on Wednesday. Tuesday, we're going to cover Newsweek. And the article was called, Dear President Bush, Guess Who's Coming to Lunch? And I'll tell you something, I got to give him credit. He was gracious, and he was a gentleman, and he took pictures with Easy, and he was as nice as could be. So I always felt real good about him. And even though I had been a lifetime Democrat, I always called myself a Jack Kennedy Democrat and Jimmy Carter Republican. So we went to the White House, and it was, of course, a big thing, and it was major, and from the cover of Newsweek, it was everywhere. So the group started to really happen, and we operated under a lot of principles that still apply today. Being as I was a school business major, overhead was very, very important to me. And we had a $10 million a month company that from the 7th or 8th month we were in business, we did $10 million a month until the day my partner died. And we had 6 employees. We didn't have a machine in the office. The 2 secretaries didn't know how to type. And they answered phones. And then I made the guys come in, Dr. Dre and Ice Cube, and all of the guys would come in. Each guy had to come in at least 1 day a week and answer the phones. And these kids would call and they'd say, you know, hi, this is so-and-so from so-and-so. You know, I want to talk to Dr. Dre. And I would say, this is Dr. Dre. And they'd say, no way. And yeah, you know, they would do it. And then we would send our entire catalog out to these kids that called in. One of the funny stories was that Kmart offered to buy 3 million copies of Straight Outta Compton if we did a clean version. So the guys didn't want to do it, but I talked them into it. And kids would call us, these 12-year-old kids would call us, screaming at us. I bought the album, it wasn't a dirty version, and you know, that isn't why I bought it. You know, this group NWA, first of all, I mean, how do you think they felt about their hometown actually putting it on the map? It wasn't on the map of the city of Los Angeles before NWA. They put their town on the map, became the 3rd largest music city in the world. next to New York and Los Angeles, was county. I mean, these guys did more. I believe that NWA did more for race relations in this country than anybody except two gentlemen that had been assassinated and probably would have gone exactly where NWA went. And Dr. King. I mean, if they weren't assassinated, that's where they would have gone. They became the most important group in the world. And they did more for everybody. And I'll tell you, we're very, very proud to be, of what we did there. We played Detroit, and obviously I had civil rights attorneys on retainer every place we went. And I always had alternate hotels and things just in case. But we played Detroit, and the mayor and the police chief called me up, and they had a very famous song called F the Police. And the mayor said, listen, you play that song in Detroit, you're going to get arrested. So I pulled the guys aside and I said, listen, we're sold out tonight. We're going to make like $350,000. I said, if we get thrown off stage, we're going to have to get refunds, we're going to lose money, and whatever. And they said, okay, one night we're going to have to play, And I was a little nervous about them agreeing so easily anyhow, because they really didn't the name of the company was Ruthless, and that's really, they were the most uncompromising, artistically uncompromising artists I've dealt with. So they get out on stage, and they do about 20 seconds of the first song. They looked at each other and started laughing. Went right into F the Police. Okay? So the cops threw some M80s in the audience and said that there was gunfire. And they rushed the stage. I got them out of there. And LL Cool J had the dressing room between us and them, and they went through LL Cool J's dressing room, and they didn't know that it wasn't NWA, so they beat up LL Cool J and all this stuff, just because they were there. We went to the Supreme Court in Ohio. Most of Ohio is a very liberal, democratic state. Cincinnati, which is right on the Kentucky border, is a very conservative Republican area. We got arrested on stage in Cincinnati. We got arrested in St. Louis. We got arrested in Milwaukee. I mean, northern cities that were just really conservative, right-wing kind of cities. And in Cincinnati, the guy that owns the Riverfront Stadium said to me, listen, I'll pay all your legal fees, but you got to go all the way with it. He said, if you go all the way to the Supreme Court with this, he said, I'll pay all your legal fees. So about halfway through, and we hired this guy, Marty Canales, Marty Canales was the guy that represented Beardsley when they arrested him in Cincinnati for, remember when the NEA, and Beardsley had that pornographic, So we used this civil rights attorney there, and halfway through, Mayor Cincinnati said to me, listen, we'll just give you traffic tickets, okay? If you just let this go. And I said, we made a deal with the people from Cincinnati. We went to the Supreme Court, which we did in several places, and always won. 1 year, we got a letter from a guy named Milt Ehlerich, who was the head of the FBI, saying that we were responsible for the deaths of 89 law enforcement officers the previous year in this country. And, when you get a letter from a guy representing the FBI, it's really not the same as getting one from the police chief of Compton or something, that's the biggest toughest law enforcement agency in the world. And we got nervous about it, and then this Democrat from San Jose named Don Edwards said, well, wait a second, what happened to the First Amendment? that's no longer applicable here, or what? So the minute he came and stood up for us, then it took some of the pressure off. So that right after that, Milt Ailerich was transferred from head of the New York office of the FBI to either Hartford or New Haven or something like that. And then was fired after that. But today, I laugh all the time because he's head of security for the NFL. Yeah, I laugh. So, you know, it was an important time, and I had lived through lots of important times and got to meet lots of really great people. And, you know, there used to be a country western club in the valley called the Palomino. It was over on Lancashire. So we used to go there once in a while. So Kinky Friedman was playing there one night, and Dill and I decided to go with a bunch of our friends. So we go out there, and the guy that owned it was a big, tall guy with long silver hair down his back, older guy. And he owned the club, and he was a real hard-ass woman. And there was this girl at the door, and she was getting hassled. And I said to Dylan, I said, Bob, see that girl? He said, yeah. I said, I attract girls like that, like a magnet. I said, you watch. As soon as she gets in, she's going to come right to her table. So he said, what do you mean? I said, yeah, you just watch. I'm telling you that I'm like a magnet for you. So the girl was wearing a feathered boa and feathers in her hair and stuff, and just bizarre. You know, she was just as bizarre as anyone could be. So she gets in, she walks right over our table, sits on my lap, and she said to me, hi, my name is Janis Joplin. It was like the first time I ever met her. Greatest singer, next to Streisand, probably the greatest singer in American history, you know? So, you know, it was a different time, and it was a great scene, and it was a lot of fun. And, you know, I just have stories after stories like that. You know, about, you know, I mean, I started with David Geffen and Irving Azoff, and what Bill Graham. I mean, Bill Graham, who became the P.T. Barnum of his generation, escaped from Nazi Hungary in 1939 and walked across Europe. He was 12 years old and stowed away on a boat and came to New York and lived with his aunt and became, you know, really, truly one of the most important guys in the history of the music business. His real name was Wolfgang Rahunga. He was a Hungarian refugee. And, you know, so to be able to interface with people like that, to be at the White House a couple of times, and it just has been a very rewarding experience for me. But of all the things that I've done in my career, there's nothing that I consider more important than the 8 years between March 3rd of 1987 and March 26th of 1995 when Eazy-E passed away. I think that those were probably the most important period of my career. And that includes Elton John and everyone else. I think that NWA, you know, defines my career and what I've done. And I've always been able to feel good about myself. And when I would watch the Lakers play and I'd see Magic Johnson dribble down the court with a smile on his face, I always said to myself, wow, I know just where he's from. And can you imagine if this guy's getting $400,000 a game to play basketball? I mean, can you imagine that I got paid to do something that I would do for free my whole life? I mean, it's just, you have to do something that you like, that you love. And if you're fortunate enough to do that, then I think that you'll have, you know, a rewarding, fulfilling career. But I've always felt so good about what I was able to do in the business that allowed me to do it. And I'd be happy to answer any questions that anyone would like to have. You know, I really will answer any question that you want to know, or advice or anything. Yes.
Thank you, Joe.
sit here in front of you. I used to watch all the DVDs as a child, and you know how NWA came about. So it's an artist in front of you and listen to your story. I have a quick question in regards to marketing. Do you think it was easier back then to market music than it is today, given social media and all these outlets that we have?
I don't think it was easier, I think it was much more difficult, but the rewards were much better. See, the internet costs nothing, so how can it be easier than that? You have an audience of hundreds of millions, if not billions of people that you can access for zero. Radio stations don't take payroll anymore. So, but the focus of the business has changed again from the music. See, because now a Snoop Dogg record costs as much to make as a Whitney Houston record. A Snoop Dogg video costs as much as a Whitney Houston video. Snoop Dogg's videos cost more than the movie Easy Rider costs to make. So it's different. The economic integrity is once again, has once again changed. And I blame an old friend of mine who was a great music lover, really was partially responsible for it. This time it wasn't the Beatles and Freddie Mercury. This time it was Steve Jobs. I mean, here's a guy that changed the world. Maybe the most important guy of your generation. And this guy single-handedly ruined the music of the time. This guy changed the world. Can you imagine the power that he had between inventing animation and iPhones? This guy was unbelievable. But he also put up $20 million of his own money in 1982 to do the US Festival and lost it. And then came back in 1984 and did the second US Festival after Woodstock and broke even. So he put his money where his mouth was. And I mean, this guy was incredible. And in my generation, Woodstock obviously was an important event. 500,000 people there in the rain, and I don't know if you've ever seen Jimi Hendrix's version of the Star Spangled Banner. Most recently, Kendrick Lamar. I mean, I like Pharrell and these guys, but I got to tell you something. I'll stand Dr. Dre's record up against anybody's that I've ever seen in this business.
What is your work ethic like, Dr. Dre, for example, to be so successful? Are they like extremely hardworking, or is it just like extreme talent that they just have?
One of the hardest working guys I've ever seen. He's a non-musician, as I am. So he doesn't really create the music. He visualizes the sound in his head and then creates the music based upon that. And sometimes it's based upon other people's music, like George Clinton or whatever. But that's part of the art form of rap. That's what rap is. It's people talking to music, and a lot of times it's other people's music. So to get back to your marketing thing, I think that so far people haven't learned how to monetize the internet as far as promoting acts go. I think that it hasn't, they don't have a monetary formula for that yet. Because the real money in the music business, 25 years ago, Irving Azoff said to me, Jerry, come on, sell your company, you'll work at Warner Brothers with me, and everything will be fine, you gotta get out. And I said, Irving, it's not what I do. Don't do that. Because he said to me, the money in the music business is all gonna be in touring and merchandise. Obviously, the guy was right. The money is all in touring and merchandising. That's where all the money is. In the music business, not in record sales. Record sales are negligible. So the Eagles, which Irving has managed since '74, they do $1 million a day in T-shirts. Rolling Stones do $1 million a day in T-shirts. And they access people my age. That's the most affluent demographic there is. People that want to recreate that moment in their lives. And they went and saw Crosby, Stills, Nash and Young at the Greek Theater. When they saw Miles Davis and the band at Hollywood Bowl, they want to recreate those moments in their lives. And they go there and they spend a lot of money. Well, when friends of mine ask me for Rolling Stones tickets, I mean, 4 tickets are $2,000. Obviously, you know, that's puts that out over a lot of people's.
And then I just have one more quick question. In your career, what was the most difficult thing? Was it starting up or keeping on going with the business? And also, what kept you going? What was your drive?
I think that, you know, I did an article for a very hip magazine that they make out of, they do this magazine out of a barber shop in New York, in the Village. It's called Frank 151. And I did an interview with them, and I wrote down what I considered some of my rules for success. And I think that a lot of the rules for success, for my rules for success, have to do with me rather than the business, okay? So I'm going to read those to you if I can get my Kleenex out of my phone. And I think that these rules have worked for me, and it's a cool book, isn't it? It carries the laptop. It's very cool. The guys have a barber shop. If I can find the arrows. Number one, work harder than anyone else. That's a critical rule. Most people really don't understand the value of hard work. You know, and I know that, like, I'm Jewish and I'm very Jewish. Right? So on Jewish holidays, I would go to work because it gave me a chance to get ahead of all the other Jewish guys that didn't go to work. Right? And I think that you can't underestimate hard work. Number two, you must know yourself. Emphasize your strengths, minimize your weaknesses. Very, very important. Number three, take every no personally and use every no as a starting point to a yes. When someone said no to me, that was a challenge. That was a challenge. And you got to use that as a starting point for years. Be imaginative. Don't be discouraged if people react negatively to your ideas. Look for artists that are trendsetters. If you're in that area of the business, there's 3 things that always work. Number one, if you're first at what you do, okay? That's always one of the keys to success. Number 2, if you're the very best at what you do. Jimi Hendrix is the greatest guitar player that ever. I probably saw him play 200 times. He amazed me every time that I saw the guy. He was unbelievable. He was the very best. Number 3, be unique. You can find artists that are unique. If someone says to you, you know, I got this guy and he sounds like Bruce Springsteen, you know, I say, well, bring me Bruce Springsteen. So, you know, when you listen to the radio, when you hear Bob Dylan, you don't say, wow, I wonder who they did. You know, so that's that unique quality that differentiates you from everyone else. Be scrupulously honest. And I say this from 2 points, from 2 different ways to look at it. First of all, you'll always feel good about yourself. But you can guarantee that as soon as you start to be successful, you're going to have a lot of people going through your shit. And, you know, you're always better off. It's just like when Easy died, his estate. He came in, he said, oh, yeah, I had Price Waterhouse. They did a study, and he said, these guys didn't even sign checks to us. They signed checks to each other. So you're saying that, you just, sooner or later, that's going to happen because people are jealous. Always be ruthless on behalf of your clients. This is sort of, more geared to people in the music business. Don't hesitate to go all the way on their behalf. People always ask me, are you still friends with John? Friends with Morrison? Are you still friends with this guy and that guy? And I found something to be universally true in my case. When you take Easy, he was like my flesh and blood son. I mean, we lived next door to each other. We had a business together. He was like my son. We had keys to each other's houses. I mean, we trusted each other with our lives. But I found that when I look at Easy, he's the exception to the rule. I was tall, he was short. I was white, he was black. I was educated, he dropped out of high school. Everything about us was exactly that. But we remained friends to the end. With other artists that I've represented, like Van Morrison, who I consider big artist. I don't know a musician that didn't know National Weeks or Moon Dance. Two incredible albums. Just one of the most despicable human beings I've ever met. I hated him. We had a business relationship. Okay? And when that business relationship ended, we had no personal relationship to fall back on like I did with Easy. So I just never saw him. When NWA broke up, I've never seen Ice Cube again after. From the day he wrote No Vaseline. I never saw him again. I didn't see him at a Laker game. I didn't see him at a Dodger game. I've never seen him again. And that was 1989. So I found that really sometimes all you have in common with people you represent is that you both like what they do. And outside of that, you have nothing in common with them. So, that's the way that I answer that question. I found that that's universally has been true. I have maybe a half a dozen friends of mine that I've represented over the years, but basically, it's our business relationship and it's our personal relationship. We're with each other because what we do very well.
Any further questions?
Because of the financial importance of merchandise and touring, is there anything you can do individually or with the friends that you have in the business or your associates to get artists to stop taking crummy little planes in bad storms and going down? We've lost too many of our best artists to people trying to get to the next location because of their tour. They're dead. They're not. I grew up with Ricky Nelson, next door neighbor. Lost a real good friend. Lost many friends to those stupid little planes. There's anything you can do to improve that.
I don't travel in small planes myself for just that reason. And I lost Otis Redding in 1967. I've lost many, many friends on small planes. And most recently, I represented a Latina artist who I thought had a chance to be the biggest artist in the world named Jenny Rivera. She flew in a 1969 Learjet, which is historically famous for being undependable and hard to handle. She had a 78-year-old pilot. The plane had a history of trouble, and her people put her on the plane because it was inexpensive. They were thinking of buying. So, you can't always do them. When I worked for Jerry Grancho, who had been a fighter pilot during Korea, he wouldn't fly with a pilot that had less than 2,000 hours in that particular flight. So whenever we took, a private plane, which we did on occasion, not too often because I don't fly in small planes. I was going through Canada with John Archer, was doing a big tour, and I walked out on the runway and they had one of those planes where the steps come down from the center underneath the flight. I said, sorry, not me, I ran the van and drove all through Canada on the van when they went on this plane. It's just, to answer your question, but now, the only people that really fly, that can afford to fly commercial, like Irving is at G5. I mean, they all have, you're talking about guys that have $100 million jets. But Jenny Rivera, didn't, and was on her way to being a very, very good star.
Do you have any further questions?
Jerry, I have a question for you. Do you think being connected to the streets and knowing various parts of how the world goes around, like the back door, for example, you mentioned block, was one of your core competencies? Like you weren't sitting behind the desk in a suit. You kind of had a feel for the streets and for business.
I grew up on the same block as Bonfires and Harmony in Cleveland. So, before my dad became successful, I grew up in an area sort of like the Lower East Side of New York, Jewish and Italian immigrants. And it was a very, very rough neighborhood. I worked since I was 11, so I knew the streets. Although easy taught me about counting. And never pull in the driveway. If a guy in a wheelchair goes in front of your car, just floor the car, And he taught me how to drive in confidence. So, there's little idiosyncrasy. In fact, I went down to see Dennis Hopper, who's a close friend of mine, who was directing a movie for me. And he lived on Indiana Street in Venice, right by Abbott McKinney and Abbott. And, I went down there and I was standing out front because he had this huge German Shepherd, biggest dog I ever saw. So I would never go to the door without getting going there first. And while I was standing out front, 4 white Escalades full of Oakwood Crepes stopped, asked me for an autograph. So, in those areas now, I'm just well known. And, people feel real good about the contribution that I made to both where they came from and giving them an alternative to being a professional athlete or a drug dealer.
Another question is, why do you think the West Coast does not have as many moguls as the East Coast as far as in the music industry and rap?
I'm sorry, I didn't quite catch that.
So in the West Coast, we talked to Dre, West Coast mogul, compared to the different areas out there like New York or Atlanta. Why do you think the West Coast hasn't captured the market?
Well, I don't think there is a market anymore. I don't think there's there's a hip-hop scene. I don't think there's any music scene. Rap music is now pop. There's no more rap music. Atlanta is pop. And that's music they play in strip clubs. That's not Public Enemy. That's not NWA. It's not Suicidal Tendencies. It's not Above the Law. That's just dance music. So that's no different than Casey and the Sunshine Band playing disco. So, there is no scene. It's just that places like Atlanta are attractive places for people to live. And there's lots of people there that are, that would like to be in the music business, and they've never been exploited before, so those areas become more important, like Miami has become, an important city, but the music business is where guys like Dre are. And that's where it is. Dre does more business than all the rest of the business put together. So, guys like Lil Wayne, they'll come along and do a little thing here and a little thing there. But, you know, guys like Dr. Dre and Pharrell and Timbaland, I mean, those are the guys that control, they are the business. And were they, if they decided to move to Austin, Texas, then the music business would be in Austin, Texas.
One last question, maybe, I think.
Yeah, I just wanted to ask what advice would you give young musicians then who are trying to break into a very different music world than the one that you grew up in?
Well, I don't understand this music business right now, because I had a really heated argument the other night at the fanciest restaurant in Los Angeles with this guy, Calvin Harris, who last year was the highest earning, made $56 million last year. So we had an argument about, you know, him telling me that what he did was as important as what Frank Sinatra did, or U2, Bono did, or the Beatles did, or the Rolling Stones. I mean, you know, he sat there and defended that position to the point where I almost was ready to get up and walk out at dinner, and he was paying. Yeah, I just, you know, there's those three rules. Be first, be unique, and be the best at what you do. Because every year somebody comes along, like Alanis Morissette. She wasn't during the folk rock era, but she sold 34 million copies of her record because it was a really good record. So if you do something that's really good, people recognize, that excellence. And there are only two musical movements in the history of our country. And I'm going to tell you one little anecdote. The only two real musical movements, and they're very similar. One is the church music. I mean, that goes back as far as written history. Gospel, soul, R&B, it all comes from the church. That's where that music comes from. And you can understand the lyrics, and people can sing, and the other is country western. Country western is the American art form. And outside of the drum and bass, they're both exactly the same. They're talking about the same things, and they're just talking about it differently. Now, country western is the new pop. These country western artists are big pop stars. So I was in Paris with Otis Redding and Aretha Franklin and Patti LaBelle. A bunch of people there playing the Olympia Theater in Paris, which is a very important venue right there. And we're playing there. And Otis Redding died in a plane crash in '67. He came off stage and he had just killed the audience. I mean, they went completely pursuit. And I went backstage with him, and he was crying. And I said, "What are you crying about?" So this is like the biggest night around. He said, "Hey, listen, man, those people don't speak English." He said, "You want to go see a foreign movie without subtitles and see if you understand it?" He said, "Those people don't speak English." And to me, at that moment, I knew that was where I wanted to be, what I wanted to do, the ultimate communication between people.
Wonderful, wonderful last words, Jerry. Thank you very much for being here with us.